Good afternoon, and thank you very much all for coming this afternoon for what is pretty much the last.
Yep.
Today we're talking about reasonable doubt. Xanthe's got a book that's come out very, very recently, which is doing remarkably well, about
Remarkably well. Thanks, Duncan.
and we'd like to hint that up to maybe even better. And it's a story that has always fascinated me, is what happens when the justice system goes wrong. And whilst it is, in my humble experience, which is about 45 odd years so far, a pretty robust, usually pretty on-the-money system, particularly in a small plug for New South Wales. I love our Supreme Court, other states. But some things do go astray, and they go astray. Well, there are two reasons why they go astray. One, that the person that should be arrested doesn't get arrested because things have gone a bit cockeyed, or that most appalling circumstance that you can't even imagine how abysmal it must be to be arrested, prosecuted, and convicted for something you didn't do. And we have, unfortunately, it happens rarely. Quite recently, and I think one of the most notable cases in Australian history is a guy called Andrew Mallett, who in Western Australia, poor old Andrew, was arrested for the murder of a woman. He was, shall we say, investigated somewhat vigorously. He was convicted, and years later they found that he spent about 12 years in prison, and Andrew was found to be completely innocent, and that the real offender was in fact still out and about. He subsequently has passed away. Andrew Mallard was released from jail, finally. He was compensated substantially. He tried to get 12 years of his life back, and he moved across to the UK because the stigma, and there was quite a stench about the case. He moved to the UK, developed a relationship with someone living in Los Angeles, went to visit her one day, stepped out on Sunset Strip late one evening. He'd been out to buy a packet of cigarettes or something or other, and stepped straight in front of a car, and that was the end of Andrew. And it was only a couple of months ago the guy who ran him over in a hit and run has finally been convicted of that. So that's an example of probably the most extreme example I could think of. Convicted for a murder you didn't commit, finally get a glimpse of a life back, and then to be killed by just a stray car. So let's talk about what happens when things go wrong.
Well, and that's a really extreme case because in Andrew's, in that circumstance, there was forensic evidence that existed at the scene which implicated somebody else very clearly. A palm print was left on a glass surface which matched somebody else. But worse than that, the offender went on to murder someone else. So if the police hadn't focused on Andrew, if they'd done their job properly, if they'd processed the scene, then the second woman would not have been killed, potentially. They could have caught him. So the implications of that were absolutely huge, that particular case.
And I suppose we were chatting earlier about a case, the Condren case, which is not dissimilar, and it's got these days too one of the great boons, I suppose, in contemporary investigation and also criminal defence too, is the forensics involved.
Yeah.
Back when I was a child, forensics were rudimentary. At best, you could, if you had a blood stain, you thought, aha, I've got a blood stain, but that's about as far as it took you. You might get a blood group if you were lucky. Fingerprints were still one of the prime methods, prime forensics of a crime scene, and reasonably bulletproof, though as we found out too, subsequently, that like DNA, they're not perfect either. DNA is, as we were just chatting about in another session, DNA is, the science is wonderful, but it's how the DNA got there to the crime scene and how it was handled afterwards that's a problem. Likewise with fingerprints. Until quite a couple of decades ago, no one realised you could actually remove a fingerprint and replace it somewhere else.
So it's really about the interpretation as well. How did the evidence get there? How is it interpreted? And people always say to me, does forensic evidence lie? And I go, no. The evidence is what the evidence is. Where it goes wrong is where it's interpreted by the people. You know, even if somebody has set a scene, then if you interpret the evidence correctly, you will be able to say that scene has actually been managed to look like a suicide, for example. So the evidence doesn't lie. It's us that gets it wrong.
And I suppose importantly too is when the police or the forensic technicians get the evidence, what they do with it. And how not only how they interpret it, but also how they store it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can go wrong at a number of stages. So the collection, the storage, later on when it's being, processed or contaminated at the lab. And we've seen that a lot in WA. They've had some really significant problems. And in the last session as well, the case Bradley Edwards was mentioned, the Claremont killer in WA, and that was a huge part of that. I mean, that went on for weeks. It was 7 or 8 weeks of evidence, and a lot of that was around the DNA and the potential contamination. Ultimately, Edwards was found guilty, but the prosecution had to demonstrate, obviously beyond reasonable doubt, and they achieved that the evidence was reliable. And I do believe it was in that case, but the problem was there was contamination at that lab. There were problems. So it didn't really matter whether, you could argue whether it could be shown in that case. The problem was there were issues at the lab. And it could have fallen over on the basis of that. And basically a serial killer would have remained at large, even if he's not necessarily of danger anymore, because the errors at that lab contaminating every case that they have ever dealt with.
Maybe bring it closer to home to some New South Wales cases you've had a look at recently, which have a selection of forensics involved in them that still have gone wrong.
Yeah. Well, okay, so there's a number in New South Wales, but if we go back to Kelvin Condren for a moment, so that's actually a Northern Territory case. So Kelvin Condren, there are a number of reasons cases go wrong, and I think Kelvin's is a good example where they show the systematic errors, and that's really what I looked at in the book. So that's tunnel vision by police. In the last session we were talking about how to run an investigation correctly, and it's following all those avenues, not picking and choosing your evidence when you start the investigation. Eyewitnesses, that was something else that came up in the last session. How reliable are eyewitnesses? I guarantee if somebody came in and committed a crime in here now, each one of you may give an absolutely honest account of what happened, but how many people are in here? 20 odd people, whatever. Everyone would be different. You would describe the offender differently, especially if they had a weapon. That's something you'd focus on. You may not even really notice that much about the offender. Everyone would give a different account of what happened. And they're all honest, but they're all erroneous in some way. And some people are better at it than others when they're identifying people. What else? Forensic evidence going wrong. Police just not doing due diligence. Racism, that's a big issue. And that was certainly present in Kelvin's case. He was found guilty of murdering his girlfriend. It was a really brutal, violent murder in Queensland, and he was actually in police custody at the time. He went to prison for 6 years, and the police just decided they had their man, pursued him, ignored the other evidence, didn't follow up with eyewitnesses potentially. There was another suspect that was in prison in Northern Territory, actually confessed to the crime, but he was just an Aboriginal guy. The victim was Aboriginal, didn't really make the press. Nobody really cared. And the implication for Kelvin is ongoing. And that's something, that these systematic errors are things we're still seeing today. So that's a good example of where pretty much everything went wrong. They had the evidence and they ignored it.
How do you get yourself out of that pickle once you've been railroaded into prison, in this case?
Yeah.
How do you actually get yourself out? That's no mean feat, I would imagine.
Well, you can't really get yourself out. And we've been involved in cases where we've actually gone back to the beginning. And it takes a long time. We've spent like a year looking at some of these cases for true crime documentaries. It's really a deep dive investigative process. And I think you need a champion. You can't get yourself out. You need somebody on the outside who's pushing for you. Often that's family, but they don't necessarily have the avenues or resources. The kind of champions that can really make a difference are the media at times. And you do a true crime documentary and enough people watch it and they go, hang on, there's a serious problem here. So you can raise awareness that way. Sometimes it's a politician. Other times it can be an innocence initiative that will take on a case and start pushing and asking questions. But it's incredibly difficult because often the police aren't particularly open to sharing information. So you need somebody who can get things under freedom of information. So you need lawyers. And that's really difficult for people in prison. It's almost impossible. And even for their families on the outside. So every case that I've looked at where a conviction has been successfully overturned as a result of a miscarriage, it's because they've had a champion in every single case on the outside pushing for them. And sometimes Duncan and I have been fortunate to be among some of those champions and working for some of those potential miscarriages.
Which there's one actually, circumspect about discussion. One we did recently, a couple of years ago.
A couple of years ago now. Yeah.
Scott Ostick, a young guy called Scott Ostick in Perth. Again, it was a challenging case. I'll be careful about describing how this miscarriage of justice
He's going to dance around it because it's going to retrial, so he's going to be very delicate at the moment.
No, it's actually before the court at the moment.
Exactly.
But it's in Western Australia. And I can just go through how publicly, maybe, chime in as you will.
Yeah. I'll be like, shh.
A bloke called, this is how things go really, really wrong. A young bloke called Scott Ostick, mid-30s, separated from his wife, a couple of kids, a fly-in, fly-out worker, working however they work the long, hard hours, come home and spend the next 5 or 6 days probably reasonably pissed. A fairly hard lifestyle, I think. Anyway, he was living in a town called Boddington it's about 120 k's southeast of Perth. Yes, southwest of Perth would be wet. He's having an on-again, off-again affair.
No. This is just I'm
being kind.
He is. Basically, he gets drunk and goes round for some nuptials, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of his regular girls who also liked him, they had a sort of reasonably uneven relationship with a young Aboriginal girl who was a teacher's aide, highly respected, lovely kid. Having her own family entanglements were problematic, and they get together when he was drunk on the way back from the pub. It's not uncommon in Western Australia. Sorry about words. Anyway, one night, this poor kid, Stacey, is murdered. And the murder is absolutely horrific. She's stabbed in a frenzied manner in her house. She staggers out into the street and she dies in the middle of the roadway. Scott Ostick has been round earlier that evening. They'd had a quick entanglement and he'd gone home moderately pissed to bed. Next morning, the coppers turn up on his doorstep around about dawn and they arrest him. They take him back to the police station and he's eventually charged with Stacey's murder. And then begins what happened, which has ended up as being 11 years of absolute horror. He has steadfastly said he was innocent throughout the entire case. He's convicted. He appeals. The appeal fails. He's in jail, still wondering how the hell he managed to get there. The evidence against him is intriguing until you give it a good hard shove. This is where Xanthé pops in a moment. And he does find he's got a lovely mother, terrific family, incredibly supportive, decent, honourable people. And they don't give up. And he eventually finds himself with the champion Xanthé mentioned beforehand. This time the champion is a really good one. He happens to be the former governor of Western Australia, who also happens to be one of the nation's leading QCs in retirement. So it's almost like that scene from The Castle where Dennis Denuto is at the High Court and Charles Tingwell, the retired QC, stumbles in and says, "I'm here to see my son." And the gentleman from The Castle says, "Oh, what's he charged with?" And Bud Tingwell says, "He's actually appearing before the court. He's a barrister." And you get this lovely moment where the two of them get together and this old QC helps Darryl through the entire process. And that's not dissimilar with Scott Ostick. All of a sudden, he's got a QC, one of the most distinguished lawyers in our history, representing him. And he puts the team together of people who also give a damn, some good lawyers, some good forensic people. And they start digging and they find all sorts of really manky things about the conviction.
Yeah, so in terms of the evidence that was used against Scott, so as soon as he was arrested, his house was a closed scene, okay? He lives with a couple of other guys. Stacey's house, where she was murdered, she was stabbed 27 times in the chest. As Duncan mentioned, it was frenzied. So both are closed scenes. The police are the only ones with access. A video and photographs are taken immediately by the scenes of crime, okay? Those are not the photographs that end up in court, though, because in between those images being taken, and this is all public record, there's nothing secret about this, a number of items suddenly appear, and these items become incredibly important later on. So outside, after the search, the murder weapon is found. That's a key one, which is this switchblade knife, which has Stacey's blood all over it. All right, so that's pretty key, right? That's found by the detectives investigating it. So imagine a scene. It's been searched by the SES, line search, the full works. They miss a 10-centimetre knife covered in blood. That's pretty problematic, isn't it? But fortunately, it's okay because the detectives investigating it find it. So that's lucky, isn't it? So that's the murder weapon with Stacey's blood on it, although it has absolutely no evidence of Scott at all. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing. And you've got to remember, at the time that he's accused of murdering Stacey, he is hammered. I mean, he is off his tree. So you have to then believe that he has killed Stacey in a frenzy. He's walked back to his house. He's allegedly disposing of the evidence as he goes. So he decides in his drunken state to drop the knife in his own basically back garden, but has managed to clean every trace of himself off said knife, but left all the blood on it. Isn't that convenient? Amazing.
And set fire to the clothing he'd been wearing that night, allegedly.
Yeah, so the clothing he's meant to be wearing, he's meant to have burnt, even though his housemates say that there was no fire. A can that was had his fingerprints on it was found outside her house, although that also wasn't found in the search the day before. And a cigarette packet with her blood on it was found at his house, although that wasn't in the original images either. So all 4 pieces of evidence, forensic evidence, linking him to this crime appeared later on. Except when he's prosecuted, only the later images are used in court. And obviously Scott doesn't know that. He's just sitting there, this poor guy, and he's such a nice guy. He's just like, I do not know what is going on. How have I ended up in court? Where has this evidence come from? It's not until this really great forensic scientist who happens to also be a lawyer starts looking at the evidence, and he notices that the metadata, so that's the information that's imprinted on the images, digital images, the original ones 30 hours earlier when the scenes are closed and they're guarded by police, they're the only people who have access. Suddenly you've got the later ones where all this evidence keeps popping up. And he's like, that's a problem, isn't it? So that is now the basis of this. He's now been acquitted of all charges and he's being retried at the moment.
Started 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, I know. So this is one to watch. Interestingly, I don't know how the prosecution are going to get across all of that evidence in terms of using it to determine guilt. The only other thing is he sent one text to her about 2 weeks before she was killed, which said she was pregnant and he was the father, and he's saying, you know what, I really don't want this baby, can we talk about it? That's it. One message, no escalation, no threats, nothing. But they're saying that that's a motive for the murder. He didn't want her to have the baby, and that's why this frenzied killing. I mean, they're ignoring the fact that he's gone round there for a quickie, right? And obviously they're on decent terms, but that was their motive. So all they have now to re-prosecute is this text. Now, if you're the jury, and obviously all of those problems with the evidence are going to come out, including the fact that these detectives are the one who charged him.
May have alleged.
Alleged. Let's dance around. Alleged, throw a few in there. Well, the detectives are the ones who found the evidence.
They were, yes.
That's factual. And so that's all going to have to come out now. Where did this evidence come from? Explain the metadata in these 2 sets. So I'm dying to watch this one unfold because I don't know how they're going to get around all of that.
And this is just a curiosity, and Xanthé's obviously technologically adept. I'm old-fashioned, and there was one other thing in the court case that astounded me. In the crime scene, and without getting to gore, a person who's been stabbed so many times, there is literally blood everywhere. And at the old trade, see, a little bit of blood goes a long way, but a lot of blood goes a lot further. So
bled to death outside. So there was a lot of blood.
It's quite horrific. But even though it might only be half a pint of blood, which is not going to kill you, it looks dreadful. But this crime scene was appalling. But in the crime scene, there were 2 sets of footprints. One belonging to Stacey, the victim, who staggered out of the house and onto the street. That's fine. But there was another set of footprints there as well in the house. And it's not rocket science to assume that those other set of footprints were probably that of the murderer. And just before it was going to the first trial, the police measured Scott Ostick's foot. And this never came out in the trial either, by the way.
No, it did not.
They popped it. He's in jail on remand. They measure his foot, and it's not the same size as the other footprints.
But they do not disclose this to the defence, the fact that they've measured his feet and it doesn't match the other set of prints. So, and this poor guy, he's not forensically aware. If somebody came and took my footprint, I'd be like, why? This is not normal procedure. Why do you want my footprint? That means you have footprints from this scene. And I would then tell my lawyer who would ask for that evidence. But Scott is not forensically aware, so he doesn't know that that's not normal process. So they have actually got exculpatory evidence, which is not disclosed, which is a failure of their duty. And so they've also got to explain that. How did I forget the footprints? Yeah.
Prosecutions in the last couple of decades have become, they're always adversarial, but I think, this is just an observation, a lot of trials, they become more aggressively adversarial. Back when I was a kid, the case would just be put forward as fairly and reasonably, certainly passionately, but fairly and reasonably. These days, I notice there is a habit to only disclose what people are asking you for. So if your lawyers aren't particularly experienced or highly informed or sneaky, like some of us, and you're not aware. I mean, here's a bloke who spent his entire life working hard, digging in mining towns. How the hell is he going to understand the sophistication of a criminal law case? And that's the same with most people. Many murderers, and some of them we've already talked about, their first brush with the criminal law is that when the police arrive on their doorstep and arrest them, and that extraordinary moment where their entire life pivots. And their experience is zero. They don't know much about it. So how the hell are you going to properly defend yourself against the entire state, which has police, it has forensics, it has prosecutors, it's got lawyers galore? What's weighted up against you? The complete innocent, and possibly the wrong term, but your naivety is extraordinary. You've got this entire apparatus of state focusing all their interests on you. It's a lonely, lonely, horrible place to be.
And Gary Jubelin mentioned this earlier. I don't know if anyone was in his session. Obviously, his child was, not anything like this, but even somebody who knows the system that well felt that weight. So imagine if you're somebody who cannot understand how you got there, suddenly there's all this evidence, you can't explain it, and you've got that whole weight of the criminal justice system bearing down on you, and you have, who do you go to? So Scott has been amazingly lucky in that he has had a number of champions. His mother has always stood by him, but don't underestimate the implications. I mean, I think they've lost their house and everything. All their savings went into trying to defend him. The father died quite recently.
While he was on remand, yeah.
Yeah, while he was on remand. And it has intergenerational impacts as well. Scott's got a couple of kids. They've now not seen their father. But they're amazing, actually. One of the daughters is now going to go on to study criminal justice because she wants to change the justice system. And I've heard kids say that since then, they want to make a difference. They've seen it go wrong. But you know what? It shouldn't be down to the kids looking at this, as young, even, recently in the William Tyrrell case, I don't know whether you heard what the sister said, the 10-year-old sister in a victim impact statement. She wants to become a police officer so she can find her brother. And that was heartbreaking. I was in the court when that was in the coroner's inquest. And I thought, this 10-year-old is saying, you have failed me and I want to fix this. And that's heartbreaking to me, that kids are looking at this going, I can do a better job than you. When they've got the whole of the New South Wales police or WA police or whatever who are letting these families down.
And I suppose at the end of one of these cases, when there has obviously been a miscarriage of justice, the thing that I find quite daunting is, if that person didn't do it, then why the hell aren't we out chasing the real killer?
Yeah.
And there's so many cases you see where the real killer has got away with murder, the hate crimes that I think we were talking about a couple of years ago here. People now who committed these crimes in their late teens are now comfortably in their 40s, early 50s, and they've got away with murder for decades.
Or even if there isn't a murder. So Lindy Chamberlain, ultimate poster child, right? I've talked about her before. Even Kathleen Folbigg. Now, I could probably do a poll in here. Some of you are going to think Kathleen Folbigg murdered her children. Some won't. But the fact is, there is genetic evidence now which predisposes at least the two daughters to serious complications that could lead to death. And they're now investigating the boys' deaths. So whether you believe or not doesn't exactly matter. I have my own opinion on it, but the evidence is not there to stack up to beyond reasonable doubt. And so sometimes there actually isn't actually an offender, and yet people are spending decades in prison as a result of when it's gone wrong.
So that also brings up the question of the use of contemporary forensics and how they're changing, not only how they're changing criminal investigations, how they're also either preventing miscarriage of justice or getting people who have had justice miscarried upon them out finally.
And DNA is a major player in that. So, again, DNA, it can go wrong. A lot of people have been found guilty on the basis of, erroneous interpretations of DNA. But we're also seeing a lot of people who are acquitted on the basis of DNA. Not only that one-to-one match, but also because, do you remember years ago they used to say there was junk DNA? Well, you kind of look at that and go, that doesn't sound very sensible to me. It's just there. We just don't know what it does yet. It's highly unlikely that it's junk, isn't it? It's like we just haven't interpreted it. And now we're learning more and more about the whole genome and all the implications of these different sequences, and we're learning about how predisposition to sudden infant death can lead to multiple children in a family dying. And so this makes, I actually expect Kathleen Vorbig to be the next big miscarriage of justice. I don't know how long it'll take, but I expect it because, as I said, the evidence isn't there. There's no evidence of harm, but there is evidence of natural causes. So she's still in prison, but I wonder how long that will go on for. And I wouldn't be surprised if she's sitting on this stage in a number of years' time talking about her experiences of the criminal justice system. Hedging it. I can see if people want to argue, you can ask me about that after. I know it's contentious, but
possibly on a less controversial. And we've seen changes in the last couple of years. Some years ago, shaken baby syndrome.
Yeah. Totally discredited.
Yeah, there was I think the most famous case was the young English nanny in Boston, allegedly looking after the child, convicted, high-profile case, sent to jail for a while. On appeal, the judge didn't think the science was quite racking up. She went back home, Woodward. Yeah. And she's now living back in the UK. She's got her own family and she's reclaiming her life. But about 2 years ago, the medical expert who secured the conviction by saying this is what happened, this is what the syndrome is about, has come out and said, I was wrong. Interestingly enough, I interviewed the prosecutor, who still flatly refuses to believe that her expert, who she believes so fundamentally when he got the conviction for her, has now changed his mind. So in part with these things, you've not only got to change the mind, the science has changed their mind, but you've also got to change the prosecutors and the system.
And there's a ripple effect. So often when an expert is used in one case, they'll be used in another case. So once they've got it wrong in one case, that can keep happening. So Colin Mannock, who's renowned for this, he was a pathologist down in South Australia, and he did about 10,000 postmortems over his career. Unfortunately, he had no qualifications in forensic pathology or histopathology. And he gave evidence in a number of miscarriages of justice cases, and one of which I cover in the book. But more importantly, or not more importantly, but separate to that, he also did postmortems in a number of child death cases. He ruled that they were natural deaths, even though some of the children had horrific, unexplained injuries, like broken vertebra and things, like serious injuries that he put down to playing on a bed, for example. And so in that case, this guy had no clue what he was doing, but utter belief in his own skills. And he was giving evidence. And so a number of people, it may not have been murder, but it may have been, contributed to death. But we'll never know because they were actually investigated then as natural deaths. So the full forensic process wasn't completed. And so we will never know if they would have successfully been convicted. But we do know that those children had horrific injuries that he ignored and said it was natural causes. And so, and he would still agree, say today that, he stands by his evidence. And that's a massive scandal down there. How he got employed is a huge problem.
It's the Keogh case.
Yes, the Keogh case.
And it's a point to make too. And it's not just some people in the system who make the error. I recall a case years and years ago we did. They called in an expert. And the medical expert that they called in, a professor from the University of Sydney, supposedly the expert in his field, the prosecution called him to refute the defence evidence. And something I haven't seen often, and not recently, is that the professor hopped into the witness box, started to give his evidence, and the defence counsel popped up and said, "What are your qualifications?" Ooh. And being a professor of Sydney University with a fairly lofty view of his own abilities, he spruiked off his qualifications from the CV.
Let me guess, they were nothing to do with the case in hand.
Precisely. Then the barrister popped up and said, "But do you actually have any expertise or qualifications in tick, tick, tick?" And he said, "No, but." The barrister said, no buts. You're not an expert. See you later. And that's what happened. I think that no one bothered to ask the question, to test them. I mean, and I suppose...
Well, you wouldn't. He's a senior pathologist working for, doing postmortems. As a barrister, I probably wouldn't have stood up and gone, "Are you actually qualified?" You know, because you kind of think, don't you, that if he's doing that job, you might actually know something about pathology. But
The painstaking nature of quality criminal defence is that you don't believe anything until you prove it. And the flip side actually works for police as well. You don't believe anything until you can prove it when you go back to a crime scene. It's that step by step. And where mistakes happen is where you assume something is the case, but you don't test it. I suppose what you're talking about, we've been talking about miscarriages of justice because the prosecutions have failed. The prosecutors have been successful. What about the cases where we know who it is? We're pretty sure, but we can't get justice for the victims because we can't arrest the offender, where the evidence is elusive.
yeah, well, and certainly we've worked on some cases, probably best not to name names, where, yeah, you do know who it is and the evidence is there, but, you know, they just can't reach that beyond reasonable doubt. And that's really frustrating for us. I imagine that's really frustrating for the police as well. But regardless, you know, we were talking about noble cause in the last session too. You know, that's something that has come up, and that's something with Lawyer X, I think, that was argued using Nicola Gobbo as an informant because they had noble cause trying to break the Melbourne gang crimes. But yeah, it's if the evidence isn't there, you can't just pick and choose to suit your case. It's all got to be investigated. Every rabbit hole's got to be followed, and everything's got to be done objectively. And that's the only way we can all have any faith in the justice system.
And moving on, I suppose, from that to with the new, and you write a lot about in your book about the use of contemporary technology, which not only DNA but linguistics and so on and so forth. What's the impact of that now on, for example, some of the colder cases? Is that becoming a tool with which we can generate some interest, generate some results?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, technology is changing all the time. DNA obviously has been around since, it's been around forever. But in terms of forensic technique, you know, the late 80s, but even recently, Golden State Killer, you know, guy was tracked down via genetic genealogy and then matched via the normal individual techniques and proven that he was a serial killer. And we're making these advances all the time. So not only in new techniques that can be applied, but also like the amount of DNA that's needed is, you know, tiny now. We can repair DNA. We can split samples when it's got a mixed sample much more readily than we can before, and older DNA. So I think going forward, you know, fingerprint techniques are improving on different surfaces with, you know, different technologies, but really it's the DNA, I think, that's taken strides recently. So it's been around a long time, but we've certainly not seen the end of what can be achieved. And I'm hoping that with genealogy and phenotyping and other techniques, we're going to start seeing the same kind of results with cold cases here that they've seen in the US. I work with a company there, and if they don't get a cold case solved, and they're a phenotyping genealogy company every week, it's a disappointing week. And we're talking cases like 40 years old. And I'm like, when are we going to start doing this here? Because imagine what we could do with some of the cold cases if we started applying these technologies. It'd be amazing.
Just phenotyping.
Phenotyping is where you take a DNA sample, and it can be anything from a buccal swab, so a cheek swab. It can be any DNA from human remains, and you can create a facial likeness of that person, just purely from a tiny sample of the DNA. So I've had it done from a buccal swab, and it is kind of creepy. I had it on my wall at work for a while because you've seen mine, haven't you? Yeah. It really looks like me, and it's purely based on thousands and thousands of analyses of the DNA samples based on and compared to photos of known persons, and figuring out where thousands of the little snips across the DNA, how they change face shape, eye color, hair color, they affect ancestry and all of these different features. And then it uses an algorithm to normalize that data and predict what you look like based on each of those little snips. So it's purely a prediction. It's not a photograph of what you look like, but it is an idea of what you should look like according to your DNA. And then you look at the different ancestral groups. Mine came back as very boringly European. I was like, yeah, I'm not exciting. I hoped, but I wasn't. And it really looked like me. And so it's an intelligence gathering tool. It's something you can put out to the public and say, have you seen this person? Not only in terms of an offender. So say you have blood at a crime scene, no witnesses, no CCTV. You've got blood of a person of interest. You can create what they look like. That's pretty awesome. Put that out. Or if you have human remains that can't be identified, where you only have partial human remains, you can create the face of that likely person and try and get them identified that way. So it's amazing what strides we're taking.
And just expanding on that too, and you do they compare that to the ancestry information that they're getting from DNA as well?
So they can be combined, yes. So what you would have is the face that can help generate leads, but also in the background, the ancestral information and the genetic genealogy kind of working sideways of that to try and generate those pathways as well to narrow it down. Then if you can get down to an area or a family, for example, so say you've got a missing person or unidentified deceased case, the genetic genealogy takes you to a certain region or a certain family, and then you show them the phenotype and say, do you know this person? So you can combine the two technologies.
No, they also, not the carbon dating, where they can actually work out where someone has been at the time. I suppose one of the mysteries that still fascinates me is that of the Somerton man in Adelaide. He was found lying on a beach wearing a suit and clutching, I think, in his pocket something for the Rubaiyat. And no one has ever worked out who he is. It's immediately after World War II. He's wearing a suit that could have been sort of a demilitarisation
All the
suit.
labels have been removed.
Everything about him. They crack open, I think, they find a key which opens a safe deposit thing in a railway station. But no one knows who he is. Curiously enough, a few people have come forward and said, probably related to him, but we've never been able to prove it. And I think recently I heard that they were going to then try and sort of pull apart, metaphorically speaking, possibly actually exhume the body and then analyse not only his DNA but also go back to look to see if they were, if
I know what he's trying to say. I'm just going to jump in.
You're
talking about stable isotopes,
That's
I believe. I was dying to say. I was like, I'm just going to wait till he pauses, and he's.
I was trying to work out something atomic.
So stable isotopes are something that you uptake mainly from the water that you drink, and each different region has a different isotopic signature. And even the food you eat, largely if it's grown locally, will have the same isotopic signature. So all of us in Sydney, we've all been here, haven't we? None of us have been anywhere. So it's actually probably quite interesting isotopically. We'll all be pretty much regionalised to where we are. Different tissues have different uptake. And depending on when the uptake happened, you can map how long ago somebody was in a certain place. For example, somebody's got long hair. Who's got long hair here? Okay, you've got long hair. So your uptake into each centimetre of your hair will reflect where you were when that hair was growing. If you went on holiday, you got off to Spain or whatever, the isotopes will change. So that portion of your hair that represents the water you were drinking when you were in Spain will have a different isotopic value to the rest of your hair, which will match to this region. So hair grows obviously quickly. It grows about, a centimetre a month, something like that. That will have a different signature to parts of your toenails, for example, which grow more slowly, or more interestingly, your bones and your teeth. So your bones, they're not dead tissue. You are generating more bone tissue. It does regenerate, and that has different uptake. And your teeth are where you were when you were growing in your mum's womb, because that was a different formation of the tissue. So different tissues across the lifespan tell you where that person was when they drank that water. Does that make sense? It's been a really long day, so I hope that made some sense.
Which sort of gets it where I was babbling on, but trying to work out what you call that, all fancy science stuff. The Somerton man, if they get around, and there's a reasonable chance they will to exhume the body, they can then analyse it to see whether or not, and there's always been this great story, was he an Australian bloke? Was he an ex-serviceman? Was he a spy? Was he a Russian spy? Was he a German spy until the war ended?
Well, we could look at his teeth to see where he grew up, basically. His permanent dentition, which is formed when you're really young, so that would give you your history of when you were a child, because it's forming in the mandibles and then erupts. And then you'd look at his bones, specifically certain bones like the femur's good, and we know the uptake into the femur to see where he was more recently. And if there was hair, that will give him his real recent history. So you look at different tissues to say he was here when he was growing up, here when his femur was developing, say 4 or 5 years ago, and more recently from his hair.
And this is quite doable, even though he was buried, 1940 something or other?
Well, now it gets complicated. Depends on the burial environment, how it's affected him. Yeah, if it's particularly acidic, that could affect it. It could denature DNA. But if it's a reasonable environment, there's a good shot we could get something. We've done it with archaeological specimens going back hundreds of years. And you can also see about diet as well. So are they predominantly a meat eater? Are they an omnivore? You can tell all those sorts of things from the stable isotopes, which can take you to a cultural background as well. That was the technical stuff.
That was actually, it was fascinating because this detail is fairly recently available. So for cold casework, that sort of opens up a whole new vista of opportunities. And I suppose one of the great things about this, we've been chatting about it a few times, is this is not the magic bullet that resolves the case, but it gives the investigators a completely fresh look at the case. All of a sudden, they've got the evidence that they didn't have before. So if you can persuade them to go back and reopen the case or review the cases, more often than not here, all of a sudden you've got this whole vista of opportunities opening up for you, particularly when you're dealing with an unidentified body or part of an unidentified body. And I think we have quite a few of those here as well.
We do, but it's not even necessarily that new technology. There was a case a number of years ago in the UK where a child's torso was found in the Thames, and it was just a torso, an African American child, and they had no idea who this child was and why he'd been dismembered. As it transpired, they did the stable isotope analysis, and that took them to a certain area in Africa, quite a small area. So they went and investigated there, and they looked for missing persons and those that could have travelled to the UK of the right age, etc., sex. And they identified a family member via DNA and then managed to identify the child. So even though they didn't find the rest of the remains, they managed to identify him. They then managed to prosecute the people who'd killed him. And that was some sort of ritualistic killing. I think they thought he was, had evil spirits in him or something, and they'd ritualistically murdered him. And that would have gone unsolved had it not been for that stable isotope analysis to take them to the right place to look for that information.
Now on that, as we're moving around.
On that cheery note, yeah.
Let's move to something a little less gory. You touched on earlier, and you've written about extensively in your recent book, Lawyer X.
Love Lawyer X. She's the gift that keeps giving, isn't she? Well, in terms of miscarriages of justice, she is. You could not go past her.
What's Lawyer X given to us?
Well, what hasn't she given? So Nicola Gobbo is Lawyer X, and she was a very high-profile criminal barrister, defence, and she was also she was informing to the police on her clients. So Tony Mockbell was one of them, and various others. She worked for the worst of the worst, didn't she, down in Melbourne?
She had an interesting client list, yes.
She certainly did. And this obviously broke quite recently. There were lots of suppression orders around this, and I included her in the book, not because she is the subject of a miscarriage, but because she's caused so many. So regardless of what you think about some of these people who are currently in prison, their evidence was tainted by the fact that she is informing on her clients. And so we've already seen appeals around that, one of which has been successful. And we're going to see a whole heap more. So there was noble cause there in that the police wanted to stop the kind of gangland war, so they were willing to use her as an informant. And now it's all falling apart. So watching this Royal Commission with interest, it may have slipped a lot of people by, but this is a fascinating one that's going to have an impact on the criminal justice system for decades to come.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I mentioned. I'm fascinated by Lawyer X for a litany of reasons. One is that they've said subsequently that it was a noble cause, and that our noble cause was to stop the Melbourne Gangland War. There may be something in that for some, but Melbourne Gangland is not quite as murky as Sydney, but it does have its moments. And the fascinating, and Gobbo, just a quick recap of the Gobbo story. Gobbo, name might be familiar. I think her uncle was the Governor of Victoria and also the Chief Justice at one stage. Brother is a prominent QC, very prominent legal family. Nicola's at law school, and this is another fascination for me, is people who like bad boys and bad girls. And Nicola was one of those people who always wanted a bad boy in her life. And it works with both genders, by the way, I've noticed too. There are some blokes I know who really like some bad in their life.
We all like a bit of bad in our lives, don't we?
Yeah. But you've got to moderate it. And she's living with her boyfriend, who is a fairly low-range drug dealer, not particularly spectacular. The coppers, as they had a habit of doing, turned up and arrested everybody. She doesn't learn from that experience, and she resumes living with the boyfriend. But I think at some stage she may have started informing on him. The coppers come back again, and she actively chases the police to be involved as an informant. And that happens for a while, and then it slips away. She's admitted to practice as a lawyer because she says, I was arrested, I was prosecuted, but I got the equivalent of here, it's the offence is proved, but there's no conviction. So if there's no conviction, then you're not precluded to be admitted to the bar, and provided you would tell them about it, of course. So that's fine. So she begins a career in Melbourne decides that criminal law is for her. She's attracted by the clients that presumably No, because if you're a criminal lawyer and you're really good at it, you don't make anywhere near as much money as you'd make down at the Supreme Court doing anything in the civil jurisdiction. It's hard work. Criminal law is brutal. The people you have to deal with, the families, the victims, everything. It's a tough gig. But she goes into that willingly. And this is the part that always fascinates me because Melbourne crime is murky. 1998, she wanders in to meet the Victorian police handlers. And she strolls into a hotel in Melbourne to meet these blokes who eventually will make her the informant, who eventually are at the very beginning of this whole disaster that's now playing out. And she's on the arm of a detective sergeant called Wayne Strawhorn. Now, I know Wayne reasonably well because I've written about him a few times. And Wayne's great problem in life was that as the second in charge of the drug squad, he had this really clever idea. He thought, if we buy the precursor chemicals to make ice and ecstasy, pseudoephedrine, from a manufacturer, and then we let it out into the criminal system, and we can follow it because we've tagged it genetically, and we can follow it to the big meth lab, and then we can go and arrest all the people. Great idea. Technically, fabulous. But somewhere along the line, not far into this great plan, Wayne thinks, oh, bugger, we'll just sell it to him. So he pops out to see a guy called Jason Moran, I think it was, or Mark Moran, one of the two, the various Morans who are no longer with us as part of the Melbourne underworld. A bloke I've written about was an undercover at when the deal's going down. So the thing's all recorded. And anyway, Gobbo walks into this hotel to meet her new handlers, and on her arm is the Wayne Strawhorn, the extraordinarily bent copper. So you think, how did this start? And then she's adopted into the system. The coppers think she's great. And I would imagine at some stage they're thinking, is it a really good idea to have a barrister as our informant?
It's not. Just so that if anyone's got any, it's really not a good idea. But anyway.
Yeah, and you mentioned noble cause. You can think, yeah, you can see some expediency in it. But what didn't dawn on them, or they chose to ignore, I don't know, was that they've just pulled the rug out from under the criminal justice system quite neatly, which leads to miscarriages. Like Tony Mockbell, who is a man who really should be in jail for quite some time, but may not spend as much time as he'd hoped for.
Yeah, and some people are going to probably, not naming names, going to go to prison as a result of this because they were fully complicit in what was going on. So, yeah, it's a mess, you know, and we're going to see this for years. You know, some very nasty people are about to be released. So where is the justice there for the families of the victims, etc.?
Yeah, and we're talking about the Melbourne Gangland War, and I think 29 people, I think, were murdered as part of the Gangland War.
Which is what they wanted to stop, which is why they were willing to use a lawyer, you know, as an informant. But, okay, you stopped it and people went to prison and now they're getting out again. And now no one has any faith in the justice system down in Victoria.
This is one single act of expediency has completely rocked the system. Courts have been misinformed. The prosecutors say they had no clue what was going on. You've duped the judges. You've duped the 12 men and women that sit in the jury. And that's really rocked everything.
Sticks. Yeah. So the question was, is forensic linguistics something that is really used? And it certainly does have a utility. When I included it in the book, it was about people who were giving confessions, and it was a coerced confession in Kelvin Condren's case. He spoke poor English, and his written English was virtually non-existent, yet his confession was in, pretty high-level written English, and yet this was meant to be his confession verbatim. So they had a forensic linguistic, somebody who studies language patterns, oral as well as written, to do a comparison. So it's certainly something that does have a place. We all express ourselves differently, and looking at those patterns certainly can help us determine if somebody did or did not write something, if they were under duress, etc. Word pattern usage is really important, and also oral patterns, how we speak when we're trying to conceal something, for example, whether we use somebody's name, so when somebody's committed a murder, sometimes they won't use, if they're denying it, they won't use the name of the victim. They're kind of separating themselves, so they'll actually speak in a different way, and if you're aware of the patterns, you can pick those up.
Yes, sir.
So the question was, if somebody is found guilty by a jury, can they be released? Well, there's an appeal system. And if it's found on appeal that the evidence doesn't stack up, absolutely they can be released. And different numbers of appeals depending on the jurisdiction. Well, Sorry, Duncan.
Oh,
Go on.
sorry. Yeah, sorry. The further question was does the jury have any impact on that? I think is where you're heading. Bottom line, no. The decision. Juries are not necessarily fallible, but if to succeed in overturning a conviction for a serious crime, particularly, we'll take murder, you really need a number of things to come into play. Things the jury didn't hear, fresh evidence that wasn't available at the time but has appeared later, which may include forensics, for example. So whilst the jury have done their duty and they've done it well and they've come to a conviction, there may be some things in the direction, for example, by the judge, which are unsound. So a complex, and it is a fairly complex series of things come into play, in which case the appeal court can then say, well, the jury got it wrong, or the jury would have had a different decision later on. So it's a review process that is also quite final as well. So whilst the jury discharge their duties well, I don't know, to be honest, sometimes they come back with the most cockamamie decisions.
But even if they come back with a reasonable decision at the time, so if we look at the Scott Ostick case, if you're the juror and you're presented with a murder weapon, you're presented with the cigarette packet, the clothes, and the can outside, okay, it was reasonable to come back with, guilty beyond reasonable doubt. However, a new jury with the new information on the basis that he's been acquitted may well come to a different conclusion because the evidence has fundamentally changed. But it's not actually easy to get an appeal heard. It can't be evidence, as Duncan mentioned, that was available at the time that just wasn't led. It has to be something, fresh and compelling that, that could genuinely make a difference in that case. Otherwise, that appeal won't be granted. So they have a place, but it's not the end of the line.
No, it's not when an appeal reverses a jury decision, it's not because they believe the jury haven't done their duty properly. It's because other circumstances have come into play that mean the jury
didn't necessarily have all the information.
Correct. Yeah, we're talking about fresh circumstances, things that weren't available at the time, contemporary forensics that have changed, things that weren't available to the jury. The jury do their duty, they bring down their judgment, and then they leave. And that's the end of their duty, completely and utterly. So it's not a comment, not a reflection that the jury have done something wrong.
And it's not just a case of, well, we don't like what that jury said, so we're just going to do it again. This isn't Trump Town. I don't like the answer, let's try again. No, it's not that. It's that there's something new to add that the jury were not aware of or wasn't explained to them, or there was some sort of error in the process.
And in many instances, too, the Court of Appeal will say, thanks for coming, but it doesn't work.
Yeah, it's not strong enough.
Yeah. Very few cases get overturned.
Unlikely to succeed.
So,
that is a really complicated question, Duncan.
Yeah, the short answer is partially. Some states, at the present moment, we're in a bit of flux. Some states have a double jeopardy ruling, others don't. Traditionally, double jeopardy was pretty much blanket, but that's gone. So yes, in answer to the specific answer is if you're acquitted, you couldn't be rearrested and retried, up until recently, and that's changing significantly. So it's a sort of watch. Different states have different rulings. It's complicated, to put it politely. There's one thing that does pop up sometimes, that if you can't prosecute them for the murder, for example, again, you may be able to prosecute them for something in that ballpark.
Or interfering with a corpse, for example, if they, you can't prosecute them for murder, but, you know that they did murder somebody and then dispose of the body, you may be able to get them on a lesser charge, but still find a criminal conviction.
Yeah. I think one of the cases that might be in your mind is the Matthew Levison case.
Yeah, that's the one I was thinking of.
Where the bloke was the alleged murderer was arrested, prosecuted, acquitted, and then after some deals were done later, told the police where they could find the body that he'd buried. And that one is a sort of beacon for it all, but it's also a very complicated case because was it murder, was it manslaughter, was it misadventure? There's a whole grab bag of things come in and we can't resolve them. But the double jeopardy thing is in play. Is about the easiest way I could put it at the moment.
It came about as a result of Barrowville, so the 3 Aboriginal children that were killed. So it's in a state of flux. The law isn't something that's static. It does respond to different circumstances. It takes a while. It's very slow, but changes can be made when it's in the best interest of justice.
Yep. Any other questions?
I think generally the question was, after we go through how it all goes wrong, can we trust the justice system? I think I think generally it gets it right. There are certainly people in prison in Australia who are not guilty and shouldn't be in prison. But I think in general we get it right. But I think the fact that there are champions, there are people who are willing to ask those questions, to challenge it when it appears to have gone wrong, I think that helps keep the checks and balances in place that we all need to make sure that, you know, the right people are in prison, and if they're not guilty, they're not in prison. So I think generally we can. I don't want you all to leave here going, oh, let everyone out of prison. No. But certainly there are some people in prison, no doubt, that are not guilty of the charges.
I complete agreement. It's an imperfect system. When you're dealing with human beings, you'll never get perfect. I've been around a hell of a long time. I think it's pretty damn good. And I've looked at justice systems in other parts of the world, and I think we have pretty much the Rolls-Royce example here. You'll never get it perfect when you're dealing with human beings, particularly when you're dealing with serious crimes that involve passions and greed, lust, revenge, money,
Love.
all that sort of love, all that sort of combine that. You're never going to get a simple and perfect system that's going to work for everybody. But fortunately, we're lucky that we have, if something goes wrong, we have an appellate system to deal with those problems, which is in place and does work and is funded. And likewise for people who are searching for resolution for a crime of which they've been a victim. We're having some remarkable successes lately on very cold case murders, which is incredibly heartening. And we're also looking at the arrests on some of the old historical child sex abuse cases as well. Things I didn't envisage 10 years ago are now happening. So I think we have a robust, very strong and ultimately very fair system. There'll be mistakes along the way, but we have a mechanism to deal with them.
Anyone else got any other quick questions before we get locked in? Yeah. It's used quite widely in the US. Some of the police forces here are kind of tinkering with it, but they're very risk averse, which I understand. It's a new technology, but you're going to see more of that in terms of, especially useful in long-term unidentified deceased cases and missing cases, because you can actually take the phenotype and age, progress it, make it look older. So say somebody went missing in 1980, you could say, well, this is what they looked like in 1980 from their DNA, and this is what they could look like now. So it's got a number of uses. So I do hope we'll start to see more of it here. Yep, phenotyping is currently being used in and genetic genealogy, actually only in the most serious of cases, those murders and serial sexual assault cases. I don't think we ought to be applying genealogy to something like, you know, break and enters, because ultimately when you're looking at somebody's family tree, you're not just looking at them. You're looking at their entire family. So there's got to be a really compelling reason to do that, because there are privacy concerns. But I think if let's do a straw poll. Who in here would want their genetics to be analysed in that way if they found out they were the relative of a serial killer or a sex offender? Would you think that was a good reason to use that technology? Would you want that person to be identified? I would. I'd be quite happy. Okay, what if it's somebody who stole a car? No, that's a privacy issue, isn't it? So I think for the serious crimes, I think it can be really useful, but we have to be very careful who's accessing it and for what purpose. And we need to keep a very close eye on that. Oh, identical twins. So, so their DNA is identical initially, but as people get older, you do get mutations in the DNA, and it is possible now to tell identical twins apart because of those mutations. However, you would still be able to investigate that and say, okay, we've got a DNA match. Oh, and they're identical twins. You would then look at the rest of the evidence to try and determine which identical twin was responsible. Well, it's always my sister, not me, isn't it? That's always the answer. And I don't even like my sister, and it definitely was her.
And on that note, we have to come to a close before we get turfed out on the pavement. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone at BAD who arranged this wonderful festival yet again in the most adverse of years.
Yes. And we'll all be back next year, and there'll be more of us. Woo! Thank you.